Hey guys, tonight we begin with the quiet, complicated, and not so glorious rise of a man whose face ended up on money. George Washington, the guy with the powdered hair, the steely stare, and a reputation that makes statues nervous. You probably know the basics. First president, cherry tree, wooden teeth. But as with most legends, the truth is more muted, less cinematic, and far more uncomfortable. So before you get too cozy, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this kind of slow unraveling of history is your thing. And tell me in the comments where you're listening from. It's oddly comforting to know who's joining us across time zones. Now maybe dim the lights, make some tea, and let's walk into the 18th century with our hands in our coat pockets and our expectations politely lowered. Let's be clear. George Washington didn't emerge from the woods one day, already carved from marble. He started off as a kid, a quiet, lanky boy born in 1732 in the British colony of Virginia. He wasn't born rich, but he wasn't poor either. His family owned land, and in the 18th century, land meant status. Not aristocracy, but close enough for the neighbors to notice. His father, Augustine, was a planter and speculator, the kind of man who measured success in acres and sugar imports. When George was only 11, his father died. That was the first quiet fracture. The boy didn't go to England for school like his older brothers. Instead, he stayed behind, managing with a frontier education, copying out rules of civility in longhand, and developing that stiff-lipped sense of control that would follow him like a shadow. He was not a prodigy. He didn't pen great essays or compose brilliant treatises, but what he did have was posture, discipline, a stillness that people mistook for strength. As a teenager, George was obsessed with surveying, not politics, not rebellion, just measuring land, plotting boundaries, drawing straight lines through wilderness like it made the world more manageable. At 17, he was already out in the wilds of Virginia, working for the Fairfax family, stomping through forests, sleeping under the stars, and sketching property lines in the dirt. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't noble, but it gave him a view of the land that most people never saw. And that's where the myth starts to crack a little, because Washington didn't fight for freedom at first. He fought for property, for status, for recognition. His early military career wasn't about liberty or justice. It was about ambition. In his early 20s, he volunteered for the Virginia militia and headed into what would become the French and Indian War. A messy, imperial struggle between Britain and France over land they didn't actually own. Washington was there to prove himself, and if he gained some land and fame along the way, all the better. Let's not sugarcoat it. His first real command went terribly. At a place called Fort Necessity, he built a makeshift fort in a soggy meadow and surrendered to the French after a brief, chaotic battle. He signed a confession, written in French, admitting to an assassination he didn't quite understand. Oops! It was the kind of mistake that could have ended a career, but somehow Washington survived it, not just physically, but reputationally. Because in colonial America, failure wasn't the end. It was the introduction. He returned from the war with a mixed record. Brave, yes. Skilled, not exactly. But he had something else. Presence. The ability to stand still while others panicked. He was tall, rigid, formal. He didn't talk much, didn't joke, and people began to fill in the gaps with admiration. He became a projection, a quiet man you could assign virtues to because he never contradicted them. And that's the thing. Washington wasn't beloved because he was dazzling. He was trusted because he was blank, a figure you could read into. He married Martha Custis, a wealthy widow with 2 children, and became one of the richest men in Virginia. But even then, his wealth came not from genius, but from marriage, land, and other people's labor. Because, yes, Washington owned slaves, hundreds by the end. And that's a part of the story that doesn't get etched in marble. But it's there, uncomfortable and real. Still, by the 1760s, George was not a revolutionary. He wasn't writing pamphlets or protesting taxes. He was a landowner, a businessman, a man who saw the shifting winds of empire and began to prepare quietly for something else. He didn't shout, he observed. He didn't incite, he calculated. Because Washington's rise wasn't explosive. It was incremental, a series of careful steps taken on muddy roads and candlelit maps. And by the time the colonies began to whisper rebellion, George Washington was already standing just close enough to be noticed, but not close enough to get burned. Not yet. The war would come. The leadership would be offered. But before that, there was still time for letters, for dinners, for watching the horizon and wondering whether the empire that made him might one day forget his name. Because before George Washington led a revolution, he had to decide if he wanted to remain part of that empire at all. The shift didn't happen overnight. It crept in slowly, like mold behind the woodwork. First came the taxes, then the restrictions, then the soldiers in red coats walking down cobbled colonial streets like they owned the place. Washington, like many landowners, watched it all with narrowed eyes. He wasn't a philosopher. He didn't quote Locke or Rousseau. He didn't write stirring essays, but he knew what it meant when distant rulers tried to dictate local lives. By the early 1770s, the colonial mood had soured, not in violent riots or loud protests, but in quiet refusals, in murmured discontent passed around candlelit parlors. Washington didn't leap to the front. He edged forward. He attended meetings. He signed resolutions. He began speaking of liberty, cautiously. His rebellion began not with a shout, but with silence. A decision not to speak in defense of the king. A decision to listen instead. And when the Second Continental Congress met in 1775 and looked for someone to lead the army, someone who wasn't from Massachusetts, wasn't too radical, wasn't too flashy, their eyes turned to the tall Virginian who didn't talk much, but looked like he meant business. He had no formal training. His war record was mediocre, but he had presence. He showed up in uniform. He didn't ask for command. He looked like he already had it. So they gave it to him. Commanding the Continental Army was not a glamorous job. It was starvation, frostbite, unpaid soldiers, lost battles, and constant requests for supplies that never came. Washington wasn't a military genius. He lost more battles than he won. He didn't invent brilliant tactics or deliver dramatic speeches before charges. But what he did was harder. He endured. He kept a fractious army from falling apart. He wrote letters. He begged, he organized, he kept men together in the mud when others would have gone home. And at Valley Forge, in the bitter winter of 1777, while men froze and starved and wondered what they were even fighting for, Washington stayed. He shared their hunger. He wrapped himself in the same worn cloth. He didn't inspire with words. He inspired with patience. While other generals bickered or schemed, Washington waited. He didn't strike until the moment was right. And when he crossed the Delaware River on Christmas night, it wasn't a grand gamble. It was necessity. He didn't win the war alone. French money helped. French ships helped. Local militias, foreign officers, chance, and attrition helped. But Washington held it all together, not with brilliance, but with steadiness, with the slow, grinding weight of someone who refuses to break. His greatest skill was survival. His most effective weapon was restraint. When the war ended in 1783, something strange happened. Washington didn't seize power. He didn't crown himself. He didn't cling to his title. He resigned. He walked away from command and returned to Mount Vernon. It shocked the world. Kings didn't give up power, but Washington did, not because he lacked ambition, but because he feared what unchecked ambition could become. For a brief moment, he disappeared. The war hero turned farmer, plowing his fields, writing letters, reading quietly by the fire. But the country wasn't done with him. Chaos returned. The Articles of Confederation buckled. The new nation, born in fire, wobbled on weak legs. And once again, they looked to him, the silent man in the background, the one who had held everything together once before. In 1787, he presided over the Constitutional Convention, not as a speaker, but as a figurehead. His presence kept the delegates civil. His silence made them serious. He didn't write the Constitution. He didn't argue the clauses. But without him, they might have walked away. He was the center of gravity, the reminder that it could work, that order could follow chaos, that a republic might actually survive. And when the Constitution was ratified and a new government formed, it wasn't really a question who would be president. There were no debates, no campaigns, no slogans or pins, just a collective nod in the direction of Mount Vernon. Washington, again, didn't ask for it, but he didn't say no either. In 1789, George Washington became the first president of the United States, and once again the myth expanded, not because he was grand, but because he was grounded, not because he demanded loyalty, but because he offered stability. The man who had survived the war now had to survive the peace. A nation held together with thread, a treasury almost empty, factions forming already. He didn't smile. He didn't joke. He didn't improvise. He set the tone, formal, reserved. He rode a white horse, wore his uniform, held receptions like a European court. He wasn't trying to be a king. He was trying to make the presidency look respectable enough to survive its first storm, because Washington knew that titles and ceremonies mattered, not for his ego, but for the country. If the presidency looked small, the nation might not survive. So he made it look large, not with gold or thrones, but with distance. He kept himself above the noise. He avoided public arguments. He didn't campaign. He let dignity do the speaking because he understood something most leaders miss. Respect comes not from noise, but from stillness. And stillness was what the country needed. In those first uncertain years, everything was fragile. The Constitution was just ink. The government was just an idea. Washington had to make it real, and he did it slowly, methodically, carefully. He chose people he trusted. He listened more than he talked. He read reports. He asked questions. He did not rush. His cabinet became legendary. Hamilton, Jefferson, Knox, Randolph. Brilliant men with clashing visions. Washington sat in the middle, letting them argue, then making his decision without drama. He wasn't always right. He wasn't always quick, but he was always deliberate. And in those early years, deliberate was enough. He toured the country, not for applause, but for visibility, so Americans could see their president, a flesh and blood man, tall, serious, distant, but present. He didn't promise miracles. He didn't stir hearts. He nodded politely, asked about roads, took notes on bridges, and moved on. Because being the president wasn't about inspiration. It was about function. But even function has enemies. Washington's presidency saw the rise of factions, Federalists, Democratic Republicans. Newspapers sharpened their pens, pamphlets flew. Jefferson and Hamilton fought over the meaning of liberty, over banks, over France, over everything. Washington didn't pick sides, not openly. He tried to hold the center, but gravity always pulls, and his lean toward order, toward structure, meant he sided more with Hamilton than Jefferson. It caused tension in his cabinet, in the country. But Washington kept moving, signing laws, creating systems, building precedent. Everything he did became a template. 2 terms, a peaceful transition, a civilian commander-in-chief. None of these things were obvious. He made them obvious by doing them first. Then came the hardest part, saying goodbye. In 1796, after 2 terms, with the country still learning to breathe, Washington stepped down, not because he was tired, not because he was unpopular, but because he believed no man should hold power too long. It was a decision rooted in fear, fear of kings, fear of tyranny, fear of himself. His farewell address wasn't a speech. It was a letter, long, cautious, and filled with warnings. Avoid foreign entanglements. Beware of factions. Cherish unity. Respect the Constitution. He wasn't poetic. He wasn't dramatic. He was careful, because Washington knew how fragile everything still was. And when he left office, something remarkable happened. He went home, back to Mount Vernon. No palace, no army, just fields and ledgers and quiet mornings. Other countries watched in disbelief. The most powerful man in the New World had just walked away from power like it was a borrowed coat. He didn't seek more. He didn't look back. He just resumed being George Washington, farmer, host, symbol. But symbols are never left alone. The years that followed weren't peaceful. Europe was at war. France and Britain threatened American trade. Political parties sharpened their teeth, and many called again for Washington to lead, to speak, to fix it. He resisted. He stayed silent. until 1798, when President John Adams asked him to command a new army in case of war with France. Washington agreed, reluctantly. He was old now, slower, less interested in politics, but still the symbol mattered. So he said yes. But it was mostly ceremonial. He didn't march. He didn't fight. He let others handle the details, because by then he had already given what he came to give: his presence, his steadiness, his example. And in December of 1799, George Washington went out for a ride in the snow. He returned home, caught a cold, and within days was struggling to breathe. Doctors bled him, applied blisters, tried remedies. Nothing worked. He asked his secretary to ensure his papers were in order. He knew what was coming. He said, "I am just going. Have me decently buried." Then he died. No drama, no last speech, just stillness. News of his death spread slowly. There was no internet, no headlines, just word of mouth, shock, silence, mourning. Across the country, people held ceremonies. Churches rang bells. Orators wept. And slowly, the man became marble. Because Washington didn't just lead a revolution. He didn't just govern a country. He became something larger, a myth wrapped in quiet. The man who refused to be king, who held power in his hands and let it go. But even myths leave shadows, and shadows once cast are hard to escape. Washington's death didn't end the story. It began the remembering, and remembering is never neutral. Almost immediately, people began shaping his image, not as he was, but as they needed him to be. The farmer, the general, the president, the sage. He became all of it, a collection of virtues wrapped in silence. Schools taught his example. Painters softened his features. Writers gave him quotes he never said. The cherry tree story, for example, completely invented. But it stuck because people wanted it to. They wanted to believe their founding father had never told a lie, that he was honesty carved into human form. But Washington wasn't carved. He was layered, cautious, private. A man who controlled his image because he understood how images last longer than truth. Even his physical body became a symbol. They measured his height, studied his teeth, preserved his hair. He became relic and role model, not because of charisma, but because of absence. He left a space big enough for others to fill, and they filled it with stories. But while the memory warmed, the legacy complicated, because for all his restraint, Washington was still a slave owner. He didn't invent slavery, he didn't expand it, but he participated in it. He relied on it. He benefited from it. At Mount Vernon, hundreds of enslaved men and women lived, worked, suffered, and died, while Washington planned revolutions and entertained dignitaries. He spoke privately of ending slavery. He wrote that he wished it might be abolished, but he didn't free them in his lifetime, only in his will, slowly, with conditions. After his wife's death, it was a gesture, a late one, and while some point to it as progress, others see only delay, because freedom postponed is still freedom denied. Even his final resting place became political. He was buried at Mount Vernon, as he wished. But for decades, there were debates about moving him to the Capitol, to a monument, to a place worthy of his legacy. But in the end, he remained where he started, on the banks of the Potomac, a stone tomb behind an iron gate, quiet, simple, permanent, and above him a country grew. Wars were fought, states added, slavery ended, then returned in new forms. His name echoed through all of it. Washington cities, Washington counties, Washington monuments, the capital itself. He became geography, a direction, a symbol on a map, too big to question, too distant to touch. But distance doesn't mean perfection. It means forgetting the small things, his temper, his awkwardness in crowds, his insecurity about lacking formal education, his long silences that weren't always wisdom, sometimes just discomfort. Washington wasn't flawless. He was disciplined, and discipline looks a lot like nobility when written in hindsight. His global image also grew. In Europe, he was the rare general who gave up power. In Latin America, revolutionaries invoked his name. In Africa, his statue stood as a model of self-rule. And in America, school children recited his virtues even if they didn't quite understand them. He became the safe founding father, the quiet one, the one who didn't shout. And maybe that's what people needed. Not a firebrand, not a poet, but a man who held things together, who didn't scheme, who didn't demand, who kept showing up, in uniform, in silence, in the cold. His leadership wasn't built on genius. It was built on presence. He showed up when it mattered. He endured when others collapsed. He didn't offer vision. He offered structure. And in the chaos of a new republic, structure was more valuable than inspiration. But structure ages. Statues crack. Myths shift. And over time, the marble began to wear. The questions grew sharper. What did he stand for? What did he build? Who did he leave behind? Because legacy isn't what you claim. It's what remains when you're gone. And what remained of Washington was complicated. A republic still struggling with its promises. A capital filled with disagreement. A nation trying to remember a man who mostly stayed silent, who left few writings, who offered few quotes, who let his actions speak even when they whispered. And so he became the blank space again, a figure to fill with meaning, or nostalgia, or disappointment. He became the face on the dollar bill, the name on a highway, the background of ceremonies, a quiet presence in a loud country. Because even centuries later, George Washington still stands at the edge of every American story, not shouting, not marching, just watching, like a statue in the rain, always present, never fully visible. Because Washington's real influence wasn't in his words. It was in his absence, in what he didn't do. He didn't seize power. He didn't build a dynasty. He didn't stay too long. And those decisions echoed. Future presidents looked to him as the model. Some followed. Some tried to imitate. Some merely used his name. But all of them lived in the house he built, the office he shaped, the limits he enforced. 2 terms, peaceful handoff, civilian command, traditions that felt obvious later, only because he made them first. Even as new ideologies rose, Washington remained a reference. When people argued about power, they quoted him. When parties fought, they invoked his farewell address. When tempers flared, someone inevitably asked, "What would Washington do?" But Washington wouldn't have said much. He rarely did. His gift was restraint, not silence, not inaction, just knowing when not to speak. And restraint in politics is rare. That's what made him different. Not perfect, not always right, but consistently careful. Even when pressured, even when criticized, he kept his distance, not because he didn't care, but because he understood that proximity corrupts, that too much control creates dependence, that leaders should lead, not linger. At Mount Vernon, he lived out his final years as a man of habit, waking early, riding his estate, reviewing accounts, writing letters. He kept up with politics, but quietly. No endorsements, no scandals, just the rhythm of daily life. Measured, predictable. He hosted guests, received news, avoided public fights. A man retreating into routine, not because he was tired, but because he believed his time had passed. And maybe that's part of why he's remembered. Not for what he conquered, but for what he released. Power, fame, control. He let go of them when most men would have clung tighter. That choice became his legacy. It turned him from man into myth. The reluctant president, the quiet warrior, the general who walked away. But myths come with shadows, and shadows hide things. The contradictions, the compromises, the costs. Washington's wealth was built on land and labor, on plantations, on systems that denied freedom while he fought for it. He knew the tension. He wrote about it. He struggled with it. But he didn't solve it. He lived in a time that celebrated liberty while denying it to many. And like many of his generation, he tried to stand still in the middle, not too radical, not too defensive, just cautious, waiting for the world to change. But the world never changes on its own. It moves when someone pushes. And Washington didn't push, not on slavery, not on equality. He hoped time would fix it, that future generations would find a way. He freed some enslaved people in his will. He asked others to be treated well, but while he lived, he kept the system intact. That part of his story lingers, quiet, heavy, often left out, but always there. Still, the world changed anyway, slowly, violently, in ways he couldn't have imagined. The country expanded. New wars were fought, new ideas debated, and Washington became the baseline, the figure against which others were measured, the one who didn't seek power, but accepted it when asked, who didn't start with greatness, but grew into it. He became the first line in the national story, and every president since has lived in that shadow. Some tried to live up to it, some tried to escape it, but none could ignore it, because he was the beginning, not the spark, not the flame, the shape that held the fire. Washington wasn't the voice of revolution. He was its spine. He didn't inspire rebellion. He stabilized it. He didn't write declarations. He made them work. And when the chaos ended, he stood at the center, not because he demanded to, but because no one else could. And in the end, that's what defined him. Not brilliance, not passion, but steadiness. The ability to be the one thing every new country needs, a foundation, even if it meant carrying burdens that no one else wanted. He didn't dream of glory. He didn't crave command. But when the moment came, He didn't step back. He stepped forward, quietly, firmly, because someone had to. And once he did, he didn't let go until the structure was sound. That was the thing about Washington. He didn't build cathedrals. He laid foundations, brick by brick, decision by decision, always cautious, always measuring. He wasn't the storm. He was the scaffolding, holding the frame until it could stand on its own, and then letting go. It's easy to forget how fragile everything was. 13 colonies stitched together by hope and paperwork, foreign powers waiting to divide them, factions pulling in every direction, and through it all, Washington kept the country pointed forward, not by force, not by charisma, but by consistency. He didn't pretend to have all the answers. He surrounded himself with those who knew more, economists, philosophers, soldiers. He listened, he learned, he chose carefully, and when he made mistakes, he corrected them. Not always quickly, not always completely, but without pride. Because to Washington, leadership wasn't about certainty. It was about balance between caution and courage, between action and patience, between being seen and staying out of the way. That's what made him rare. He didn't need to dominate. He needed to endure. In private, he worried about the strength of the Union, about the rise of parties, about the return of monarchy in disguise. He wasn't naive. He knew how easily liberty could be traded for order, how quickly republics could rot into empires. He read history. He remembered Rome. That's why he stepped down. That's why he refused a third term, because he feared what too much reverence could become. If the people needed him forever, then the republic had failed. So he left, not as a hero, as a warning. That power must have limits, and those limits must be honored. Even now, his legacy is felt in moments so small, they're barely noticed. The peaceful transfer of power, the expectation that presidents leave, that armies obey civilians, that no one man defines the nation. These ideas didn't invent themselves. They were planted, nurtured, repeated, until they became habit. That's what Washington gave the world. Not speeches, not brilliance, but habit, repetition, ritual. He made democracy look normal, and that, in the age of kings, was revolutionary. Of course, no legacy is without contradiction. While Washington warned against political parties, they formed under his watch. While he urged neutrality, his policies tilted. While he wrote of freedom, his home was a plantation. And while he stepped down from power, he never fully left the center. Even in retirement, his name carried weight. Politicians invoked it. Foreign leaders respected it. And the American people, unsure of the future, kept returning to it. Not because he was exciting, but because he was constant. Statues were built, books were written, the myths expanded. But the man beneath them remained quiet. He left few personal reflections, no sweeping philosophies, just records, letters, ledgers, decisions made with care, evidence of a man who valued duty more than drama. And in that quiet, something grew. A new kind of leadership, not inherited, not divine, but earned, temporary, bound by rules, answerable to the people. Washington didn't claim it. He modeled it, and in doing so, he reshaped the world's idea of what power could look like. Even abroad, the ripples spread. In Europe, where thrones still stood tall, revolutionaries whispered his name. In Latin America, liberation leaders spoke of his example. In places where tyranny was tradition, he became the symbol of a different path. One without crowns, one where leaders could leave. But symbols are tricky. They can be bent, simplified, turned into slogans. Washington became the face of a nation that still struggled with the very ideas he represented. Liberty, unity, justice. He wasn't their perfection. He was their beginning. And beginnings are messy. They don't arrive fully formed. They stumble. They contradict themselves. They reach too far, or not far enough. Washington knew this. He lived it. He didn't pretend to be the end of the journey, just the first careful step. And careful steps are what keep nations from falling. Not leaps, not speeches, just the steady rhythm of one foot in front of the other. That's what Washington gave the country. A model of movement that wasn't loud, that wasn't desperate, that wasn't built on applause, but on repetition, on order, on the belief that slow, careful progress could outlast chaos. And in that quiet rhythm, the United States found something to hold on to, a shape, a method, a kind of political muscle memory. Presidents followed his example even when they didn't know it. Citizens expected certain norms because he had set them. No crown, no palace, no lifetime rule, just service. Then exit. That pattern wasn't inevitable. It wasn't natural. It was built. And Washington helped build it by refusing what others would have taken. When asked to stay, he left. When urged to lead forever, he declined. When power approached, he stepped back. It was not weakness. It was intention. Because he believed that leadership wasn't about the man. It was about the office, the system, the process. If it depended on personality, it would crumble. But if it could survive his absence, then maybe it would survive anything. So Washington became the first to leave the stage on purpose. And that choice echoed longer than any law, longer than any speech. It showed that republics could live beyond their founders, that institutions mattered more than men. That democracy was not just rebellion, it was discipline. And in time, other countries noticed, slowly, quietly. They began to see that the American experiment might endure, not because it was flawless, but because it was structured, because it had limits, because one man had chosen to walk away instead of rule forever. But even as the image of Washington grew, the man behind it remained elusive. His writings were practical, his speeches formal, his tone always measured. There were no confessions, no memoirs, no glimpses behind the curtain, just the visible part, the general, the president, the host at Mount Vernon. It leaves a strange silence, a figure known for what he didn't say, admired for what he didn't do, a legacy written in restraint. And maybe that's the point. Washington's power wasn't in volume. It was in gravity. He pulled people toward order, toward caution, toward continuity, not because he demanded it, but because he embodied it, in posture, in dress, in presence. Even his letters reflected that tone. Formal, thoughtful, never too much, never too little. He signed them your most humble and obedient servant, not as flattery, but as expectation. That public service required humility. That power was temporary. That duty came first. Those ideas weren't common. They were constructed, passed down, repeated, reinforced, and Washington helped write the blueprint. He didn't finish it. He didn't fix every flaw, but he made it possible. By staying steady, by staying available, by leaving when it was time. And when future generations looked back, they saw more than a face on currency. They saw a figure who had chosen not to rule, who had stepped aside again and again, who had helped a fragile idea survive its earliest tests. Of course, that doesn't erase the contradictions, the compromises, the silence on issues that mattered, but it doesn't erase the structure either, the frame that held while others shouted, the model that survived louder moments, the shape that held even as the country stretched. Washington was not the fire. He was the stone it was built around, and stones do not speak. They stand. And in their stillness, they remind us of what was risked, what was chosen, what was left behind. Even now, in a world far louder, far faster, his image remains. On walls, on coins, on monuments, but also in expectations, in the quiet belief that leaders should leave. That office should not become identity. That government, at its best, is not about glory. It's about gravity. And gravity doesn't announce itself. It just holds things in place, which is maybe why people still look to him, not for answers, but for shape, for balance, for a reminder that nations begin not with noise, but with weight, that the most important acts are sometimes the quietest ones, a refusal, a resignation, a step back. Washington remains that shape, unmoving, not because he had no flaws, but because he knew they mattered, and he worked within them. He didn't pretend to be above them. He lived inside contradiction. He led a fight for liberty while denying it to others. He spoke of union while watching division grow. He feared power even as it followed him, but he kept showing up, not to declare, but to steady, not to dominate, but to organize. His brilliance wasn't in his plans. It was in his presence, a presence that let others believe this thing might actually work, that a people might govern themselves, that rebellion could become routine. His death didn't change that. It only solidified it. He died at home, not in office, not in exile, not in battle, but in his bed, on his land, with his legacy still being written. That, in itself, was the message. A republic doesn't need martyrs. It needs examples, models, quiet figures who show how to hold power without being consumed by it. And when the nation faced its future, it carried his image forward, not because he demanded it, but because he allowed it. He didn't brand himself. Others did it for him. And in doing so, they created a symbol too large to match and too quiet to question. But beneath the image was a man, and the man was imperfect, not a prophet, not a savior, just careful, measured, present, and sometimes that's enough. Sometimes the best legacy isn't a grand vision. It's a set of habits, a tone, a model of how to be when no one knows what to do next. Washington gave the country that model. He wasn't ahead of his time. He was exactly on time. When things were unstable, when faith was fragile, when the newness of it all threatened to snap under the weight of expectation. He held the center, long enough for others to build around it. And that's why he lasted, not because of myth, but because of rhythm. A predictable pattern in unpredictable times. A steady hand on a spinning world. His name now lives everywhere, on schools, on parks, on cities, on bridges, spoken daily without reflection. But still, underneath that repetition, there's the echo of who he was and what he chose not to be. He didn't crown himself. He didn't rewrite the rules. He didn't linger. He left before they asked him to stay. He set a limit, and then he obeyed it. That choice, more than any victory, more than any law, shaped the country that followed, because it taught that leadership was not possession. It was trust, and trust ends when you refuse to give it back. And so Washington remains, in silence, in outline, in the small expectations that leaders should behave with weight, with pause, with purpose. That power should end, not because it is lost, but because it is given back. And in that quiet return, the real work begins.